Hey everybody, just a disclaimer before the video begins. My regular microphone that I've been using for years completely died on me today, but I wanted to get a video out to you guys, so I had to use my headset mic. The sound quality is not great, but a new microphone is on the way. I hope you enjoy these stories anyway. Number 1. Stormy Walk. Immediately after graduating from college, I got a decent job and bought a nice little townhouse in the city of Chicago. It was a decent neighborhood, which I was able to afford because I had a decent job. However, anyone who lives in Chicago, especially in certain areas, knows that often it can be more of a pain to have a car than to not have a car. So I opted to take the L to and from work and to do other things. There are a few things that do suck about taking public transportation everywhere. One is that not all the vehicles are necessarily very clean, and often, whether you are sitting or standing up, you might be thrust up against some unsavory or dirty people. And very, very often, you would find yourself having to walk through the elements, and that could sometimes be a pain. I had a job in an office building downtown. I really don't care to mention which one, but it was in the Loop. The thunderstorm was obvious, and I hadn't brought an umbrella with me. Although it wouldn't be much of a walk from the building to the subway station, it was a bit of a walk from my stop to the house. Had I been going to work, I probably would have sprung for a cab. It would have sucked to have been wet all day at work, but I couldn't really bring myself to do that on the way home. I absolutely hate taking cabs in Chicago, and I knew I could just dry off fine when I got home. The storm moved in pretty quickly. If you have never seen a thunderstorm from a high floor of an office building, I will say you're missing out. It was beautiful. The sky was a mix of black and dark green. The wind was strong, and it became nighttime outside when it was still supposed to be light outside. The thunder came soon after that, and it was so loud that I got audible oohs from some people in the office building. When it was time for me to go home, nothing much had changed. It had been raining and the storm was still going strong. I was quite lucky to be able to get from my building to the subway entrance without getting wet. Yeah, there were a lot of awnings, and I did my best to remain under them. Plus, it was only a few blocks away. I lived in a nice neighborhood on the north side of the city. As the L went on and came out from the underground, the storm was back on full display. There were tons of wet people on the trains, and I just decided to keep on my feet. When we got to my stop, it was still pouring outside. I got out, went down the stairs, and out the door. I was at that point under the bridge of the train itself, preparing myself to get totally soaked before I got home. It was completely dark out by this point, and not just because of the storm. The sun had set, and it was gone for the evening. As I mentioned, I wasn't very close to the stop, so although there were tons of people who got off the stop with me, by the time I got close to my street, I was walking by myself. I got to my street and turned on it, looking at the other houses as I walked down the street. It sort of made me miss living in the suburbs, because I didn't know any of these people. Likely I never would, but many living rooms were on full display. I got to the gate that would let me into my yard, and I don't know why I did it, but I looked up and scanned the windows. At the moment, I without a doubt saw a face looking at me from the window of my living room. I mean, it was only a split second, and then it was gone. But I knew exactly what I had seen. Someone was in my house, and no one should have been in my house under any circumstances. I didn't know what to do. I just stood there in shock for a few moments. I hadn't even put my key in to open the gate yet. I grabbed my cell phone and quickly called the police. While I was on the phone, I was faced away from my house, but when I turned around, I once again saw someone peeking out of my window. I was scared and hoped the police would hurry. I figured I should get as far down the street as I could. Before I could go anywhere, though, I saw the front door of my house open. Some guy came out of the house. He looked at me for a moment, then turned and ran down the alley between mine and my neighbor's house. I watched as he disappeared into the backyard. By the time the police had gotten there, he was long gone. But they had a good idea of who he was. The young lady I had bought the house from had a long and abusive relationship. The police had been at the house several times. The final time, after a brutal beatdown, the guy had completely disappeared. Fearing for her life, the woman sold the house and moved on. The police had his information and picked him up later. I was able to positively identify him as the man who had been in my home. He never knew his ex had moved away and was waiting in the home for her to arrive. And with his history, there was no telling what he would have done to her, or to me, if I'd entered the house in the darkness, and he didn't know I wasn't her. Number 2. Someone. Every now and then, it is really hard to always know the difference between what is real and what is fake. I think that is the reason that many times you get so many stories on YouTube where parents don't believe their children. Whether that is from ghosts or monsters or other things, it seems to happen quite often. It seems like there is always a new story about a kid who has an imaginary friend who turns out to be a ghost or an intruder or something like that. Now, my story isn't exactly like that. Nothing paranormal happens in it. This was back in the 1990s when I was a teenager. I was 16 years old if I remember it correctly. I had a 12-year-old brother and a 7-year-old sister. During that time period, my parents were both working, and I ended up having to babysit quite a bit. This didn't bother me at all. It became more common when my parents got a second job on the weekends. Have you ever seen those brand new subdivisions that seemingly pop up overnight? And on the weekend you'll see all those temporary signs that show and advertise them and give directions to their open houses and such? Well, on Friday night, my parents would go out and put all those signs up. Then on Sunday night, they would take them down. They had to wait until nighttime in order to put them up, and were usually gone from anywhere between 4 and 6 hours. I am relatively sure that this also took place in the early spring. I recall getting home from school after I had drama practice. It was still light outside, but it wouldn't be too long before that would no longer be the case. So I had to get home in time for my parents to get out and get their thing going. I had intended to make some hamburger helper and some stuffing for dinner, but my parents decided to spare a little bit of money for us to buy some pizza. I found out later that this was because they had heard on the news that a storm was coming in that evening. It didn't seem like it was going to rain to me, because the sky was clear. However, they believed it would, and this meant that they would be gone a bit longer than usual. So the pizza was sort of a way of saying sorry that they would likely not be home before my siblings were in bed. My parents had only been gone for about 20 minutes when we noticed the wind picking up. This was followed shortly by sounds of thunder, which were getting closer and closer very quickly. So I ordered the pizza very quickly because I knew I would feel bad if the pizza delivery person got caught in the storm. And yeah, I know that seems like a silly thing to feel guilty about, but that was the sort of guy I was. And when I got off the phone, which was in the kitchen, I went into the living room. My brother and sister were both sitting down and watching television. I didn't pay attention at first to what they were watching, and took out one of my books in order to get a start on some homework. It was actually a few minutes that went by before I realized my brother was watching the X-Files. Yeah, probably not a big deal to anyone listening to the story, but keep in mind my younger sister was 7 years old. This was definitely too scary for her to be watching. Anyway, I put my sister in the kitchen and let her watch something else on the TV there. I did my homework at the table. By the time the pizza delivery had arrived, it was already storming hard. But after opening the door, the strange behavior of the delivery guy made me sort of uncomfortable. I let him into the foyer while I took the pizza and went to grab the money. When I came back, I noticed he had moved further into the house and was looking up at our staircase to our second floor. It was weird, but I was easily able to get him back towards the door when I told him that our parents would kill me if the carpets got soaked. While I was paying the guy, he started asking questions about the house. He said he thought the house was pretty nice and wondered how much my parents had paid for it. I told him that I didn't know. He made a comment, saying that my parents must have had decent money, which I shrugged at. They didn't, or else they wouldn't have been out in the storm, putting up signs overnight. But that wasn't any of his business. When the guy asked me if the bedrooms were all upstairs, I decided I had to just get him out of there as quickly as I could. I didn't think he was dangerous, but I was just really creeped out by him. Around 9 o'clock, I had to go ahead and put my sister to bed. I could tell she was a little freaked out by the storm, and she was likely a little scared after watching some of the X-Files episodes. So I kept her nightlight on and her door slightly opened. I waited for her to fall asleep, and then I went back downstairs to do my homework. About half an hour later, sitting in the living room, I noticed that my sister had come down the stairs. I asked her what was wrong, and she told me that she thought she heard someone upstairs. This wasn't unusual for her. It didn't surprise me at all, but I doubted she had actually heard anyone since the storm was so loud. Likely, she was just scared of the storm, plus the bit of the X-Files that she had gotten to watch. I asked her if she would feel better if I stayed in her room until she fell asleep. The readiness of her agreement just confirmed in my mind that I was correct. If she honestly thought somebody had been upstairs, she wouldn't have readily agreed to go back to bed so easily. So I took her back upstairs and put her to bed. It didn't take long for her to actually fall asleep. Once I was sure that she wouldn't be getting back up, I went ahead and went back downstairs to do homework. As the storm raged on outside, about 20 minutes later, my sister was up again. She came back downstairs. I always did my best to be as patient as possible with her. And again, this really wasn't that strange of an occurrence. When I asked her this time why she had gotten back up, she told me she heard someone walking around in her room. Her door was closed too, and she never, ever closed the door. But she had come downstairs. I prepared to take her upstairs again, but before I did, I heard something that was different than the storm noises, and this was undeniable too. I heard someone walking around on the top floor of the house. I froze and listened closer to try and make sure I knew what I was hearing. Undoubtedly, there were some definite footfalls coming from the top floor of our house. Someone was up there. My mind immediately thought back onto the pizza guy. He had been asking a bunch of questions about the house, including if the bedrooms were up there. He probably figured out that my parents were not at home as well. He could have broken into the house, since he had had the mistaken idea that we had money. I didn't hesitate, though. I wasn't the type to take chances. I quickly had my sister and brother put their shoes on, and we ran out the door to our next-door neighbor's house. From there I called the police, and was going to just wait for them to arrive. However, the husband was one of those gung-ho types, and he was going to grab his gun and check the house out. I was able to finally talk him out of it because if the police mistook him for the intruder, he might get shot. It didn't take long for the police to arrive at the house. There were 2 cars. 3 officers went to my house. I had left the door unlocked. The 3rd came over to the house we were in. I kept waiting, watching the house. I just knew that the officers were going to be hauling that creepy pizza delivery man out of the house. I prepared for it, nearly braced myself for it. The police brought someone out of the house. I could easily tell, though, it wasn't the pizza delivery guy. I mean, this guy was much different looking and much smaller than the pizza delivery guy had been. I watched as they put him into the car before coming over to the house. The guy was a heroin addict who had been in and out of jail and was homeless. He'd actually broken into our house during the day when my parents were at work and we were all at school. He was looking for money or something to sell. However, my parents got home before he had a chance to get out. So, he holed himself up in my sister's bedroom closet. Several times he tried to make his way out of the closet, but wasn't lucky enough to do it. They did find a weapon on the guy. It was a knife, but they didn't believe that he was going to harm any of us, if it wasn't necessary. He hadn't attacked my sister, who was the most vulnerable the entire time. But seriously, none of that alleviated the fear I'd felt that night. Just thinking that someone was upstairs and scared my sister, and I honestly thought it was just in her imagination. Number 3. After school. I was 9 years old when this story happened, and I lived in a neighborhood that really wasn't the best around. But in spite of that, there wasn't much busing to and from school. Most of the students had to walk to and from. I recall many times walking in really deep snow in really cold weather. Also, we sometimes did have to walk in the rain. That was usually really worse than the cold and the snow. Or at least, I always hated it. I stayed behind at school for about an hour and a half on this day. This was because there had been a storm waiting to begin for quite a while. I was hoping that it would pass over, or storm really quick and then stop. But it did neither of those things. So after a while I realized I was just going to have to walk home and brave the rain. I had an umbrella and a raincoat, but that didn't make me feel any better. I just hated the idea of being out in it at all. And that never kept my feet from getting wet, and I hated that the most. So I finally set out on the way home from school. It still hadn't began raining at this point, and I thought I might actually have a chance of making it home before the rain fell. This was coupled with the realization that I had left school right when it was over. I would have been home already, and I would have missed the rain 100%. Well, you know what they tell you about hindsight. About halfway home, the rain began lightly falling. Distressed, I immediately got my umbrella out. I tried to hurry up and make it all the way home. As I was walking, I passed by this old home that I had never seen anybody at. There was a guy on the front porch. I had never seen him before either, but for some reason he got up and came out onto the front lawn. The house was across the street from me, but for some reason this guy began calling for me. I mean, he had to be calling for me, even though I didn't know him at all. I mean, there was no one else in the street other than him and me. "Hey kid, come over here," the man yelled at me. I stopped and looked at him, but I did not cross the road. "It's gonna start pouring any second here, kid. Just come over here and I'll call your parents. They can come and pick you up." I didn't know how to respond, but I was young and not too bright. So I told the man that both my parents were at work, so I couldn't call them. I then turned back and began walking a bit. Out of the corner of my eye, I was able to see the man walking in the same direction as I was. He called out to me again, saying that he could give me some cookies and hot chocolate while I waited for the storm to end. Again I stopped. This time, though, I didn't respond to him. I just turned away and began walking a little faster. This time, though, I noticed that he began crossing the street toward me, and he was walking fast, too. I immediately broke and ran to the closest house that I could get to. I began pounding on the door, which was quickly answered by another man that I didn't know. I pointed at the guy and said he was chasing me. The man from the house looked over and saw the man, who had turned and began running back down the road. He immediately understood something had gone wrong, and he began yelling at the guy running. He told him he better keep running, because he was going to call the cops. The second guy offered to let me come into his house, but I was alarmed at the idea. Understanding my predicament, he instead decided to walk me home. He got me all the way home, and that was when we got in touch with the cops. Well, the house that the man was at was not inhabited at all. It had been empty for years. When they went to check it out, the man who chased me wasn't there. My impression is that this man was just waiting along the road for a lone child walking home from school to abduct. I guess being caught in the rain was a very good excuse for him to try and get a kid to come into the house. Fortunately for me, this happened in the early 80s. There were many child abduction TV specials at that time, and I'd seen them all. I was absolutely not going to go into a stranger's house.
Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to click the subscribe button and bell below, or click the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.